June 4th, 1942. Northern Pacific Ocean, 180 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The sky is already busy. High above the rolling blue, Japanese Zero fighters carve lazy arcs, their engines humming with the confidence of men who believe the battle is already decided. Below them, the decks of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu are alive with motion. Flight crews jogging, fuel hoses snaking across planks, ordnance handlers sweating under the rising sun. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's First Air Fleet is executing a textbook operation. Midway will be struck again. American resistance will be finished. The Pacific will tilt decisively toward Japan. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, a formation of American aircraft is climbing slowly, painfully, into the morning light. They are not impressive. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading VB-3 from USS Yorktown, can feel it in his bones. The Douglas SBD Dauntless shudders as it climbs, its right R-1820 engine straining, airspeed bleeding away. The plane vibrates, rivets rattling, the sound less like a predator and more like a farm machine pushed past its limits. You can hear every vibration through the stick. The Dauntless is not sleek. It is not fast. At just over 250 miles per hour at best, it is already obsolete by European standards. Its fixed landing gear is enclosed by awkward pants. Its frame is sturdy but inelegant. Japanese pilots have a nickname for it, slow but deadly, and they say it laughing. To them, the SBD is a relic, a dive bomber that belongs to another era. Against the Zero, lighter, faster, more agile, it is meat. American pilots know this. They have known it since the early days of the war, since Pearl Harbor, since the Marshalls, since the Coral Sea. They do not expect to dogfight. They expect to die if caught. The Dauntless was never designed to win air battles. It was designed to fall. As Leslie levels out at altitude, scanning the horizon, he can see other formations converging. Fragments of squadrons from Enterprise and Hornet, scattered by weather, navigation errors, and pure bad luck. The attack plan is already unraveling. Below them, torpedo planes have gone in first and been annihilated. Through broken radio transmissions, the truth filters upward. VT-8 from Hornet, VT-6 from Enterprise, VT-3 from Yorktown. Devastators flying low and slow, torpedoes slung beneath wings like anchors, charging into walls of flak and Zero fighters. They are dying in minutes. Planes hit the water in flames. Crews vanish. Radio calls cut off mid-sentence. The Japanese are doing exactly what they trained to do, and they are winning. On the bridge of Akagi, Nagumo watches reports scroll in with growing confidence. Enemy torpedo squadrons destroyed. No serious damage inflicted. Combat air patrol fully engaged. This is how American attacks usually look. Disorganized, brave, futile. The Zeros are down low now, hunting survivors, finishing the torpedo bombers, their pilots flushed with adrenaline and certainty. The sky above them, high altitude, is empty, or so it seems. Lieutenant Dick Best of VB-6 from Enterprise pushes his Dauntless higher, eyes squinting through the glare. His oxygen mask tugs at his face. The cockpit smells of oil and sweat. His rear gunner, James Murray, scans behind them, knowing it won't matter if fighters appear now. They are too high, too slow, too exposed, but they keep climbing. What Japanese doctrine never truly accounts for is this. American dive bombers are willing to be irrelevant for hours if it means being decisive for seconds. The SBD Dauntless is not about speed. It is about timing. At 10:20 a.m., the impossible happens. Through a break in the clouds, Leslie sees them, 4 carriers, perfectly aligned, decks crowded, aircraft spotted for launch, wings folded and unfolded, fuel hoses still connected, bombs stacked in neat rows. The Japanese fleet is in the middle of a fatal transition, rearming, refueling, reorganizing. The most dangerous moment for any carrier force. And the sky above them is suddenly full of American dive bombers. Not one squadron, several, arriving from different directions, uncoordinated, unscripted, but together. For a heartbeat, no one reacts. Japanese lookouts are zero. Staring down, not up. Zero pilots are. Low on fuel and ammunition, chasing torpedo planes that no longer exist. Then someone shouts, "Aircraft! High altitude!" Leslie pushes the nose down. The Dauntless tips forward. The world rotates. Wind screams as the dive brakes snap open. Perforated flaps deploying with a violent shudder that would tear lesser aircraft apart. The SBD locks into its signature maneuver, falling nearly straight down, nose pointed at the deck of Soryu. This is where the Dauntless becomes something else. Not slow, not outdated, but terrifyingly precise. Leslie grips the stick, airspeed climbing past 300, 350, 400 miles per hour. The carrier fills his windscreen. Individual figures are visible now. Men running, pointing, frozen. He centers the sight. He waits. And somewhere on the Japanese carriers below, officers who once laughed at American dive bombers realize, too late, that the joke is over. The Dauntless is screaming now. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie feels the aircraft shudder as it plummets through thin cloud, the carrier deck of Soryu swelling until it fills his entire world. Tracer fire claws upward, erratic, desperate, far too late. Anti-aircraft guns bark from the ship's flanks, black puffs blossoming uselessly behind him. This is not a fight. This is execution under gravity. Leslie forces himself to wait. Every instinct screams to release early, to pull up, to live. He ignores it. Training takes over. The muscle memory drilled into him back in peacetime, when instructors insisted on discipline over fear. 500 feet. 400. 3. He thumbs the release. The bomb drops clean. In the same instant, Leslie hauls back on the stick. The Dauntless rips upward, dive brakes snapping shut, the airframe groaning as G-forces slam his body into the seat. For a split second, he thinks the wings might tear off. They don't. Behind him, Murray shouts something unintelligible. Below, Soryu explodes. The bomb punches through the flight deck and detonates among armed aircraft below. Fuel ignites. Ordnance cooks off. The blast rolls outward like a living thing. Flames racing along hangar spaces packed with torpedoes and bombs that were never meant to be struck. Across the formation, it is happening everywhere at once. On Kaga, bombs from Enterprise's VB-6 smash through the deck near the island. One detonates amid fueled aircraft. Another near elevators jammed with planes waiting to be launched. Fireballs erupt, shockwaves knocking men off their feet. On Akagi, Dick Best dives alone, the rest of his squadron split by confusion and chance. His bomb strikes near the carrier's centerline, just aft of the island. It is a single hit. It is enough. The explosion ignites aircraft and fuel lines, stacked carelessly below. Flames surge upward, licking the bridge. Damage control parties rush in, and are driven back almost immediately by heat so intense it warps steel. In less than 6 minutes, 3 carriers are mortally wounded. Japanese officers stare in disbelief. This is not how carrier battles are supposed to unfold. There is no prolonged exchange, no gradual attrition, no chance to recover. The First Air Fleet, the pride of the Imperial Navy, undefeated since Pearl Harbor, is unraveling in moments. Vice Admiral Nagumo stands rigid as reports come in, each worse than the last. Fires out of control. Flight decks unusable. Aircraft destroyed before launch. Command and control collapsing under smoke and confusion. He had believed the American attack broken. Instead, it had merely been invisible. The irony is brutal. The torpedo squadrons that died so completely did not fail. They succeeded in the only way left to them, by dragging Japanese fighters down, by fixing a tension, by forcing Nagumo's fleet into constant maneuver. They created the opening, and the Dauntless fell through it like a hammer. Above the burning carriers, American dive bombers scatter, climbing away through flak and smoke. Some are hit, some trail fuel. Some will ditch before reaching their carriers again. But the damage is already done. On Yorktown, men watching from afar struggle to understand what they're seeing. Smoke columns rise where Japanese carriers should be advancing. Radio reports crackle in fragments. Carrier hit. Multiple fires. Enemy decks burning. No one dares say it yet, but they feel it. The impossible is happening. Japanese pilots returning from patrol land on decks that are already infernos, or cannot land at all. Some ditch alongside their ships, watching helplessly as the platforms they depend on for survival burn beyond saving. For years, Japanese naval doctrine has emphasized offensive spirit, decisive strikes, elite air crews. It has assumed that the enemy will break under sudden, overwhelming blows. What it never truly accounted for was vulnerability in transition, and the Dauntless exists for one purpose: to punish transitions. It is stable in a dive, forgiving, able to place a 1,000-pound bomb within yards of a target from altitude. It does not need speed if gravity does the work. Japanese pilots had laughed at it because they evaluated aircraft as fighters evaluate opponents. They asked the wrong question. The right question was not, can it dogfight? It was, what happens if it reaches the dive? Now they know. By early afternoon, only Hiryu remains operational. Vice Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, aggressive and clear-eyed, orders immediate counterstrikes. He understands the situation instantly. If the American carriers are not destroyed now, Japan loses everything. His pilots launch into a sky already thick with smoke, rage, and disbelief. They find Yorktown, the carrier that should not exist, and strike her twice. Bombs, torpedoes. The ship lists, recovers, is hit again. Even now, the ghost persists, but the pattern cannot be reversed. Later that afternoon, American dive bombers find Hiryu. They do to her what was done to the others. By nightfall, the ocean burns with wreckage. 4 Japanese fleet carriers lie crippled or sinking. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots are dead. The spearhead of Japan's naval power is gone. And it happened because of an airplane no one respected. Not fast, not elegant, not feared. Just patient, just precise. Just there at the moment everything went wrong. As darkness settles over the Pacific, Japanese officers begin to understand that they did not lose Midway to luck. They lost it because they misunderstood the weapon descending out of the sun. Night falls over the Pacific in fragments. Burning oil slicks glowing orange against black water. Flares drifting down like dying stars. The silhouettes of destroyers weaving through wreckage to rescue survivors. The sea is crowded with men who were elite only hours ago, clinging to debris, watching their world sink around them. On Yorktown, the flight deck is scarred and littered with debris from hurried recoveries. Planes land with damage, some barely controllable, tires screeching as arresting wires catch. Deck crews move automatically, exhaustion pushed aside by adrenaline. No one is celebrating. Not yet, because they don't fully understand what they've done. Below decks, intelligence officers begin piecing together the reports. 3 Japanese carriers burning. A 4th heavily damaged. Enemy air strength collapsing. It sounds exaggerated. Impossible. Carrier warfare does not end like this. And yet it has. Far to the west, aboard the shattered remnants of the First Air Fleet, Japanese survivors struggle with a realization that cuts deeper than defeat. They were not beaten by a superior aircraft in the way they understand superiority. They were beaten by a machine designed for a moment they failed to anticipate. The Douglas SBD Dauntless is not new in 1942. It is not sleek. It does not inspire awe on paper. Its Wright R1820 engine is reliable but unremarkable. Its speed is modest. Its lines are chunky, almost agricultural. Japanese pilots compare it to their A6M0 and laugh. The Zero is faster, more agile, graceful in a climb, deadly in a turn. In air combat, it humiliates heavier American aircraft again and again in the early months of the war. The Dauntless cannot compete there, and that is precisely why it is not meant to. The SBD was built around one truth: ships do not dodge gravity well. Its perforated dive brakes, mocked as clumsy, unnecessary drag, allow it to plunge steeply without tearing itself apart. Its rugged airframe absorbs punishment that would cripple lighter planes. Its pilot sits high, with excellent downward visibility, staring straight into the target during the most terrifying seconds imaginable. The Dauntless does not sneak in. It announces itself, and then it commits. American training reflects this philosophy. Dive bomber crews practice until they can place bombs with near-mechanical precision. They are taught patience, to hold the dive longer than feels survivable, to ignore flak, to trust the brakes and the structure and the mathematics of falling. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, prizes speed, initiative, aggressive maneuver. Their carrier strikes rely on coordination, timing, the smooth cycling of aircraft through decks and hangars. It works, brilliantly, when the rhythm holds, but it leaves no margin when that rhythm breaks. Midway breaks it completely. The Dauntless exploits chaos better than any aircraft in the Pacific. It thrives on disarray, on exposed decks, on fueled aircraft waiting for orders that never arrive. That is why it does not need to be fast. It only needs the moment. And the moment arrives because Japanese pilots are chasing torpedo planes that cannot hit anything. By the time Japanese fighter controllers realize what is happening above them, it is already too late. The dive bombers are past the point of interception. Gravity has taken over. In Tokyo days later, the shock hardens into something colder. Reports are reviewed, diagrams drawn, timelines reconstructed. The conclusion is unavoidable. The Americans did not win because their pilots were braver. They won because their system allowed an unglamorous aircraft to be exactly where it needed to be when everything went wrong. That is deeply unsettling, because it means Japan's advantage, elite pilots, superior fighters, offensive doctrine, did not fail in isolation. It failed against an opponent who did not try to mirror it. The Dauntless represents that refusal. It is slow because it does not need to outrun fighters. It only needs fighters to be somewhere else. It is rugged because it expects to be shot at. It is simple because it is meant to survive mistakes. And above all, it is replaceable. That last truth is the one Japanese planners struggle with most. The men lost at Midway are not easily replaced. Their training took years. Their experience cannot be rushed. Each loss is a wound that does not heal. The Dauntless crews lost are mourned, but new crews arrive. New aircraft roll off assembly lines. The machine keeps returning, indifferent to sentiment. This is not heroism as Japan understands it. It is endurance as policy. In the weeks after Midway, American pilots talk about the battle in subdued tones. They speak of torpedo squadrons with reverence, of luck, of timing. They do not boast about the Dauntless. They simply keep flying it, at Guadalcanal, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz. Again and again, the same pattern repeats. When carriers are caught refueling, when decks are crowded, when fighters are out of position, the Dauntless dives. Japanese pilots stop laughing. They begin to fear the shape of it overhead. The squared wings, the slow, deliberate approach, the way it seems to hang for a heartbeat before tipping forward and vanishing straight down. By 1943, Japanese airmen nickname it something far less dismissive. They call it the slow death, because speed, they have learned too late, is not what decides carrier battles. Position is, timing is, and gravity never misses. June 4th, 1942. Midway Atoll, late morning. The sky above the Japanese fleet looks empty now, deceptively calm, as if the violence has already passed. Smoke columns rise where carriers burn, but the air itself feels still, too still. On Hiryu, the last operational carrier of the First Air Fleet, Vice Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stands on the bridge and understands something his subordinates are only beginning to grasp. This battle is no longer about damage. It is about time. Every minute that passes favors the Americans. Yamaguchi does not hesitate. He orders a counterstrike immediately. What remains of his air group is launched in two desperate waves. Dive bombers first, then torpedo planes, aimed at the American carriers before they can fully regroup. Japanese pilots climb into the sky, knowing the truth even if no one says it aloud. This is not a calculated offensive. It is a race against inevitability. They find Yorktown first, damaged, patched, scarred, and very much alive. Bombs slam into her deck, fires erupt. For a moment it looks as though the carrier is finished at last. Then something unsettling happens. The fires go out, the smoke thins. Within an hour, Yorktown appears operational again. When Japanese pilots radio back their reports, disbelief bleeds through their professionalism. Enemy carrier still functioning. Yamaguchi closes his eyes briefly. Of course it is. The Americans are not fighting to preserve ships. They are fighting to keep them present. A second strike is launched. Torpedoes find their mark this time. Yorktown lists sharply. Flooding spreads. Captain Elliot Buckmaster finally gives the order that cannot be delayed. Abandon ship. Men slide down lines into the Pacific, watching the carrier settle lower, stubborn even now. She will die later. But not yet. And not before she has done what she came to do. Because while Japanese air crews are focused on killing a ship that should not exist, American dive bombers are already climbing again. This time, they are looking for Hiryu. At 1700 hours, the sky above Hiryu darkens with shapes the Japanese now recognize instantly. Douglas SBD Dauntless. They arrive in small groups, staggered, unspectacular, and unstoppable. Bombs hit. Fires spread. Fuel ignites. By nightfall, Hiryu is a burning wreck. Yamaguchi chooses to go down with his ship, standing on the bridge as flames consume the carrier. The First Air Fleet ceases to exist. All of it. 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, the core of Japan's naval aviation, destroyed in a single day. And when Japanese officers begin reconstructing how this happened, they keep returning to the same moment. The moment when slow, outdated dive bombers appeared out of nowhere. The moment when gravity became a weapon. The moment when minutes mattered more than machines. In Tokyo, the initial reports are cautious, sanitized, incomplete. The truth is too catastrophic to release at once. But inside the Navy Ministry, there is no confusion. Midway is not a setback. It is a fracture. Japanese doctrine has been built on decisive battle, on the belief that superiority at the moment of contact determines the outcome of wars. That elite pilots, superior aircraft, and aggressive tactics can force resolution. The Dauntless destroys that belief, because it proves that wars are decided not by the best machine, but by the machine that survives chaos. The SBD is not elegant. It does not dominate the sky. It waits, it endures, it punishes mistakes. And in modern war, mistakes are inevitable. American naval aviation absorbs Midway differently. There is relief, yes, but also unease. The victory feels fragile, accidental, balanced on timing that could not be replicated by design alone. But buried within the chaos is a realization that will shape everything that follows. You do not need to be faster than the enemy. You need to arrive when they are most vulnerable. You do not need perfect aircraft. You need aircraft that function when everything else goes wrong. The Dauntless becomes the embodiment of that lesson. It will not survive the war unchanged. It will be replaced eventually by faster, heavier aircraft. But its philosophy, ruggedness, precision, commitment, becomes doctrine from that day forward. Japanese pilots never again laugh at American dive bombers. When they see the slow shapes overhead, they scatter, because they know what follows, not a dogfight, a plunge, and then fire. Summer 1942, across the Pacific. News of Midway spreads unevenly. Official communiques are clipped, cautious, stripped of detail. But pilots talk. Sailors talk. Mechanics talk. And within weeks, a quiet shift begins to ripple through both navies. The Douglas SBD Dauntless is no longer a joke. In Japanese ready rooms, the tone changes first. Pilots who once scoffed at the American dive bombers' fixed landing gear and sluggish climb now speak about it with something closer to respect and fear. They describe the sound before impact, a rising howl, sharp and unmistakable as the aircraft dives almost vertically. They describe the way bombs seem to fall straight down the throat of a ship, as if guided. Most unsettling of all, they describe how hard the Dauntless is to stop. At Midway, Japanese Zero pilots had pounced on the torpedo bombers first, shredding them mercilessly. The Dauntlesses, high above, had been ignored, not because they were unseen, but because they were dismissed. That mistake will never be repeated. From late 1942 onward, Japanese fighter doctrine begins to shift. More aircraft are held back for high-altitude cover. Combat air patrols are stretched thinner, forced to watch every level of the sky at once. The margin for error narrows, and narrowing margins mean strain. On the American side, Dauntless crews return to carriers that feel different now. They are greeted not as stopgaps or placeholders, but as men who wielded a decisive weapon. Their aircraft may still look outdated, but no one laughs at it anymore, not even the pilots who fly it. Lieutenant Commander Clarence "Dusty" McCluskey, whose decision at Midway led Enterprise's dive bombers to the Japanese fleet, is quietly promoted. He does not give speeches. He does not celebrate. He understands how close the battle came to disaster. Fuel gauges were near empty. Search patterns nearly failed. Timing was accidental. Midway was not a blueprint. It was a warning. The U.S. Navy takes that warning seriously. Training intensifies. Dive bombing accuracy becomes obsession. Crews drill repeatedly on approach angles, release altitudes, recovery procedures. They practice attacking ships already maneuvering, decks cluttered, smoke obscuring targets, because that is how real battles unfold. The Dauntless is pushed harder than its designers ever imagined, and it holds. The aircraft absorbs punishment that should kill lighter machines. It limps home with holes in wings, shredded control surfaces, wounded gunners still firing from the rear cockpit. It crashes often, but rarely because it fails structurally. That reputation spreads. In 1943, When newer aircraft like the SB-2C Helldiver begin to arrive, many pilots react with hesitation. The Helldiver is faster, heavier, theoretically superior, but it feels unforgiving, complicated, less honest. The Dauntless, by contrast, tells you exactly what it can and cannot do. And in combat, honesty is survival. At Guadalcanal, Dauntless crews fly daily, sometimes twice daily, from Henderson Field and from carriers operating at the edge of exhaustion. They strike destroyers in the slot, transports unloading troops, cruisers bombarding the island at night. They do not always sink their targets, but they disrupt, they delay, they force maneuver, and that matters, because Japanese naval doctrine has never been built around disruption. It is built around decisive outcomes, clean victories, final blows. The Dauntless offers none of that. It bleeds the enemy instead, slowly, relentlessly. By late 1943, Japanese after-action reports begin to include a recurring phrase when describing American air attacks. Enemy dive bombers persist despite losses. Persistence. It is not speed. It is not elegance. It is not surprise. It is persistence. The SBD becomes a symbol of how America fights the war in the air, not through brilliance, but through endurance. Not by avoiding damage, but by continuing despite it. Japanese pilots sense this asymmetry acutely. They are still skilled, still brave, still dangerous. But they are now irreplaceable, and they know it. American pilots are replaced, trained, sent back. The Dauntless fits into that system perfectly. It is easy to maintain, easy to repair, forgiving to fly. It is not meant to dominate. It is meant to keep showing up. And as the war grinds forward into 1944, that quality becomes decisive. When American carrier groups surge across the Central Pacific, Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas, Dauntless squadrons are still there, flying alongside newer aircraft, filling gaps, striking when needed. They are no longer the cutting edge. They are the backbone. And every Japanese pilot who looks up and sees the familiar silhouette diving toward him understands the truth now. The laughter is gone, because they have seen what happens when those bombers arrive at the wrong moment. And in war, moments are everything. June 19th, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The sky is vast, empty, and deceptive. Lieutenant Junior, Grade Richard Dick Best peers out from the cockpit of his SBD Dauntless as the carrier formation below him fades into a haze of blue and white. The radio crackles with half-heard reports, contacts forming, fighters engaging, bombers inbound. This is not Midway. This is something else entirely. Below, the U.S. Fifth Fleet advances like a moving city. Fast carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all coordinated, layered, rehearsed. Radar screens glow in darkened combat information centers. Fighter direction officers, vector Hellcats with calm, clipped commands. Above them, Japanese aircraft are coming. Hundreds of them. This will later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But in the moment, there is no humor in the name. The Japanese Navy has thrown everything it has left into the sky. Veteran pilots mixed with rushed replacements, planes lightened for range, crews hoping for one decisive strike to reverse the war's momentum. The American response is methodical. Hellcats tear into incoming formations at altitude, their pilots guided by radar, warned early, positioned advantageously. Japanese planes fall in spirals of flame long before they see a carrier deck, but not all of them. Some break through, and when they do, the old pattern threatens to repeat itself. Japanese commanders expect to find American carriers crowded with aircraft, decks cluttered, fuel lines exposed, a Midway in reverse. What they find instead is space, order, time. American carrier doctrine has changed profoundly since 1942. Aircraft are cycled efficiently. Decks are kept clear. Strike packages are launched and recovered with clockwork precision. And when Japanese ships are located, the response succumbs swiftly. Dive bombers descend. Among them, Dauntlesses, fewer now but still present, rolling into their familiar, terrifying plunge. The scream returns. The angle steepens. Bombs fall. Japanese carriers maneuver violently, twisting away, desperate to spoil aim. But the SBD's strength has never been speed. It has been accuracy. Bombs strike flight decks, elevators, hangars. Fires erupt. Aircraft are destroyed before they can launch. Even when ships are not sunk, they are crippled, removed from the fight. And once again, Japanese pilots feel the imbalance. They have flown everything they have. They have lost most of it. The Americans, by contrast, continue launching. By late afternoon, the sky is American. Not because the enemy has vanished, but because he has been exhausted. This is the final evolution of what began at Midway. The Dauntless is no longer the surprise. It is the constant. It fills the gaps between generations of aircraft. It strikes when newer machines are unavailable, grounded, damaged, or reassigned. It absorbs losses and keeps flying. Japanese pilots understand now that it is not enough to shoot one down. Another will come, and another, and another. In debriefings after the battle, surviving Japanese aircrew speak in careful language. They do not dwell on the Dauntless itself, but on what it represents. The enemy aircraft attacked in waves that did not end, one pilot reports, even when we believed we had repelled them. That belief, that repulsion equals safety, no longer holds. Because American air power is no longer organized around decisive strikes alone. It is organized around pressure, continuous, grinding pressure. The Dauntless taught the US Navy that lesson early. It showed that a weapon does not need to be fast to be fatal. It does not need to be elegant to be decisive. It needs to arrive at the right moment, and keep arriving. By 1944, the American carrier force has learned how to create those moments deliberately. Radar, fighter control, logistics, training, all align to ensure that when dive bombers descend, the enemy is already off balance. Midway was accidental. The Philippine Sea is engineered, and the Dauntless, despite its age, fits perfectly into that engineered war. It flies from carriers, from island airstrips, from makeshift runways scraped out of coral and mud. It launches in heat, rain, and turbulence. It brings its crews home, wounded, shaken, but alive, more often than not. The aircraft does not promise invincibility. It promises return. That promise matters, because by now Japanese pilots understand something terrifying. They are not fighting an opponent who needs to be perfect. They are fighting one who plans for imperfection. The Dauntless is proof of that philosophy in aluminum and steel. And as the war pushes inexorably toward Japan's inner defenses, that philosophy becomes unstoppable. Carriers fall. Pilots die. Islands are bypassed, isolated, starved. And through it all, American dive bombers keep appearing overhead. Not always the fastest, not always the newest, but always there. The laughter that once greeted the Dauntless has turned into something quieter. Recognition. Because in the end, wars are not won by the weapon that looks most impressive. They are won by the one that endures long enough to matter. October 24th, 1944. Sibuyan Sea, Philippines. The weather is merciless. Low clouds, intermittent rain squalls, visibility collapsing without warning. From the cockpit of his SBD Dauntless, Lieutenant Commander William Bill Brooks can barely see the ocean below. Only flashes of grey water between ragged breaks in cloud. Then the radio crackles. Battleship sighted. Bearing 085. Multiple contacts. Brooks tightens his grip. This is no carrier. This is worse. Below them lies the Japanese center force, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, moving with grim determination toward Later Gulf. Among them is Musashi, one of the largest battleships ever built, armored beyond anything the Dauntless was designed to face. And yet Brooks rolls his aircraft over. The dive begins. The scream returns. That mechanical wail that has followed SBD crews from Pearl Harbor to Midway to the Marianas. It is no longer shocking. It is ritual. The Japanese gunners below open fire instantly. Black bursts of flak claw upward. Tracers streak past the cockpit, close enough to feel like insects brushing skin. Brooks forces his eyes onto the target, ignoring everything else. Musashi grows larger, impossibly large. He releases. The bomb falls. It strikes not with a catastrophic explosion, not yet, but with a violent, concussive thud against the deck. Smoke billows. Fires start. Damage accumulates. And Brooks pulls out, barely. What happens next is something the Japanese Navy has never experienced at this scale. The attacks do not stop. They do not come in a single, glorious wave meant to decide the battle in minutes. They come in layers, hours of them. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters strafing and harassing. The Dauntless is part of that grind. Its bombs do not need to penetrate Musashi's thickest armor. They tear up decks, jam elevators, cripple anti-aircraft guns, rupture fuel lines, force damage control teams to choose between fire and flooding. Piece by piece, the battleship is reduced. By late afternoon, Musashi is dead in the water. She sinks slowly, massively, taking with her not just thousands of sailors, but the last illusion that size and protection alone can guarantee survival. Japanese survivors will later describe the attacks in exhausted, hollow terms. "They came again and again," one officer writes. "We shot them down, but still they came." This is the Dauntless's final contribution to the war. Not spectacle, attrition. By late 1944, the Douglas SBD is no longer the centerpiece of American carrier air groups. Helldivers replace them on decks. New aircraft promise more speed, more payload, more modernity. But the Dauntless does not vanish. It is reassigned, repositioned, used wherever reliability matters more than novelty. And Japanese pilots, those who remain, notice something chilling. Even when they believe they have adapted, even when they believe they have learned American patterns, the attacks continue, not always with the same aircraft, but with the same logic. That logic was born at Midway, that a slow aircraft, if accurate, disciplined, and persistent, can collapse even the strongest fleet. After later, there is no more laughter in Japanese pilot messes, only fatalism. The Dauntless has stripped away the myth that victory belongs to the fastest or the boldest. It belongs to the side that can keep striking when others cannot. And by now, Japan cannot. Its pilots are fewer, its fuel scarce, its training rushed, its losses irreplaceable. America, by contrast, absorbs losses and keeps flying. And the Dauntless, battered, obsolete on paper, but lethal in practice, has taught them how. In the final months of the war, SBDs fly patrols over island chains no one bothers to name anymore. They attack coastal shipping, isolated garrisons, retreating columns. They are no longer glamorous. They are inevitable. Japanese ground troops look up and no longer try to identify the aircraft. They already know what it means. Bombs will follow. After the war, Japanese naval historians will write that Midway was lost because of timing, miscommunication, bad luck. They are not wrong, but they miss something essential. Midway was lost because the Japanese Navy underestimated a weapon that did not fit their idea of how modern war should look. The Dauntless was slow, ungainly, outdated, and perfectly suited to the war it was asked to fight. It punished moments of vulnerability. It exploited hesitation. It turned minutes into disasters. By the time Japan understood that lesson, it was too late to adapt. Because you cannot redesign doctrine in the middle of a dive, and when the screaming begins, there is no time left to laugh. March 1945, Yokosuka Naval Air Base, Japan. The hangars are quieter now. Not silent. Nothing in war is ever truly silent, but hollow. Engines echo longer than they should. Footsteps sound isolated. There are too many empty revetments, too many aircraft that will never fly again. Lieutenant, junior grade, Masao Tanaka stands beside the wing of a Zero with chipped paint and patched fabric, watching a mechanic tighten bolts that should have been replaced months ago. Tanaka is 22. He has flown combat patrols over the home islands. He has never seen an American carrier with his own eyes. But he knows the sound. Every Japanese pilot does. That distant, rising howl, not from a siren anymore, but from memory. The dive bomber scream that once seemed theatrical. Excessive, almost ridiculous. Now it means death. Tanaka's instructors used to joke about American dive bombers. Slow, predictable, easy targets if you kept your speed and altitude. They showed gun camera footage from early 1942, Zeros slicing through clumsy formations, tracers stitching wings. Those instructors are gone now, killed at Midway, killed at Guadalcanal, killed in the Philippine Sea. The men teaching Tanaka learned second-hand, from manuals revised after catastrophe. They no longer talk about speed. They talk about timing. "Do not let them reach the dive," one lieutenant commander told Tanaka bluntly. "If they start down, it is already too late." Because everyone knows what happens next. The SBD does not maneuver once it commits. It does not dodge. It does not dance. It falls like a hammer, and that certainty, that inevitability, is what broke Japanese confidence. The Dauntless was never meant to win a turning fight. It was meant to arrive at the worst possible moment when decks were crowded, hoses stretched, crews distracted, and decisions half-made. That moment defined Midway. Japanese carriers were not destroyed because they were weak. They were destroyed because they were busy, refueling, rearming, reorganizing, and the SBD punished busyness. By 1943, Japanese naval staff studies reluctantly admit something unthinkable before the war. The dive bomber, not the torpedo plane, had become the decisive carrier killer. This is a doctrinal earthquake. Japanese naval aviation had been built around the torpedo attack. Precision, coordination, and mass. Dive bombers were seen as support weapons, useful for airfields and ships of opportunity. The Americans inverted that logic. At Midway, torpedo squadrons died horribly, but they dragged fighters down, pulled cap away, fractured attention. Then the dive bombers arrived and ended everything. The SBD became the embodiment of that sequence. Sacrifice below, judgment above, destruction in minutes. Tanaka learns this not from lectures, but from absence. There are no experienced pilots left to argue otherwise. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the men who flew the Dauntless are aging fast. Lieutenant Commander Dick Best survives Midway, but never flies combat again. Lung damage from oxygen failure ends his career. Others die later, shot down, burned alive, lost to the sea. Few of them think of themselves as war-changing figures. They think of checklists, altitudes, release points, pull-out angles. The Dauntless rewards discipline, not bravado. That, too, is why Japanese pilots misunderstood it. They expected flair. They expected aggression. They expected speed. Instead, they faced patience. At reunions decades later, Dauntless pilots will say the same thing. You didn't feel fast. You didn't feel invincible. You just did the job. And that job reshaped naval warfare. After Midway, every navy in the world redraws its assumptions. Carrier decks are armored differently. Damage control doctrine changes. Aircraft handling procedures become obsessed with speed and dispersion. Because Midway proves something terrifying. A fleet does not need to be defeated over days. It can be erased in minutes. And the tool that did it was not the most advanced aircraft in the sky. It was the one that arrived at exactly the wrong time. By August 1945, as Japan faces surrender, Tanaka never flies his final mission. Fuel shortages ground him. His aircraft is cannibalized to keep others flying. When the war ends, he will tell American interrogators that Japanese pilots had stopped mocking American dive bombers long before the end. "We feared them," he says simply, "because when they appeared, it meant we had already failed." That is the final truth of the Dauntless. It did not win by outmaneuvering enemies. It won by exposing mistakes. And in war at sea, mistakes are fatal. The Douglas SBD Dauntless entered the war already obsolete. It left having destroyed more enemy carriers than any aircraft in history, not because it was the best machine, but because it was the right one at the exact moment when seconds mattered more than speed. September 1945, Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego. The Dauntless sits on the tarmac like an artifact from another age. Its paint is faded. The dive brakes are pitted and warped from salt air. The cockpit smells of oil, canvas, and years of sweat that no one bothered to scrub away. Newer aircraft crowd the ramps now. Sleeker, faster, louder. Machines built for a future that assumes Midway has already been learned. Lieutenant Commander Clarence "Dusty" Kleiss walks past the SBD without stopping at first. He has flown it into history. He has also flown it into obsolescence. Kleiss is 30 years old and feels older. The war has burned years out of men like him. He has survived Midway, survived later campaigns, survived watching friends die doing the same thing he did, rolling over into a vertical dive, trusting gravity, trusting training, trusting a machine that never promised to bring you home. The Navy does not celebrate the Dauntless the way it celebrates battleships or carriers. There are no grand ceremonies for aircraft that look awkward in photographs and lack the glamour of fighters. But among aviators, its reputation is settled beyond argument. The SBD is spoken of with a kind of quiet respect, not affection, not nostalgia, but acknowledgement. It did what was asked, nothing more, nothing less. At the Naval War College, instructors dissect Midway frame by frame. They freeze gun camera footage. They diagram flight paths. They talk about decision loops, about safety altitude, about the fatal timing of Japanese rearmament cycles. And inevitably, they come to the same conclusion. The Dauntless did not win because it was superior. It won because it was available. Available when torpedo squadrons were dying. Available when Japanese decks were full. Available when minutes, not hours, decided fleets. That availability is not accidental. The SBD is easy to maintain, easy to fly, forgiving under stress. It is designed not for brilliance, but for repeatability. And repeatability is what wars run on. In post-war interviews, Japanese officers are asked the same question again and again. Why Midway? Why did everything collapse so fast? Some blame intelligence failures. Some blame Nagumo's hesitation. Some blame fate. But a few answer more honestly. We underestimated the enemy's method, one former staff officer admits. We believed war would reward skill. It rewarded timing. That timing belonged to the Dauntless, not because its pilots were reckless, but because they were patient enough to wait, disciplined enough to hold altitude, and trained enough to dive when the moment finally arrived. In the years that follow, dive bombing as a concept fades. Jet aircraft arrive. Missiles replace bombs. Vertical dives become unnecessary. But the lesson remains. Victory does not always belong to the fastest weapon. It belongs to the one that arrives when the enemy is least prepared to be interrupted. At Midway, Japanese pilots laughed at American dive bombers because they judged them by appearances: slow, bulky, outdated. They paid for that judgment with 4 carriers and the strategic initiative of the Pacific War. The SBD Dauntless never laughed back. It simply dove, and when it pulled out, the war had changed direction forever. That is how the Douglas SBD Dauntless should be remembered. Not as a miracle, not as a legend, but as proof that in war, the deadliest weapon is not always the one that looks impressive. It is the one that does exactly what it was built to do, at the one moment when failure is no longer survivable.